Greetings. My name is Angelo Gavrielatos and I'm the Project Director at Education International, our global union federation, responsible for our global response to the growing commercialisation and privatisation of education. Before I go any further, can I extend greetings of solidarity on behalf of Education International. You know that our global union federation represents more than 32 million teachers and other education workers in more than 170 countries in 404 organisations right around the world. Like you, Education International is proud, concerned and very engaged in education policy globally, but also working with and through national unions to ensure that we are able to not only articulate but be effective in the development and implementation of sound policy. In 2015, at our World Congress, it was determined that Education International establish a global response to the growing commercialisation and privatisation in and of education. It was the first resolution debated at World Congress and it was unanimously endorsed. It was unanimously endorsed because it was recognised by member organisations around the world that the threat of the growing commercialisation and privatisation of education was such that it put at risk certain fundamental beliefs that we hold as teachers. Fundamental beliefs in public education, in quality education, and what that means for each individual child, their family, their communities and nations as a whole, whether they're large or small. It was acknowledged that privatisation is the greatest threat to the achievement of inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning for all. Over the last number of years, we've engaged in a deep discussion and analysis about the impact of privatisation. But what we hadn't done very well is to create a global response, genuinely linking national campaigns to confront this phenomenon, or rather to confront this cancer, the cancer to quality education for all. We said that it was enough in terms of describing the problem. We no longer needed to describe the problem, but more importantly, we needed to link up national campaigns to deliver a genuine global response. Our analysis led us to the conclusion that we're dealing with actors, the size and reach of which we had not predicted, that were exerting incredible influence over education policy. And by actors, I'm talking about global corporations, edu-businesses, seeking to commercialise, to monetise every aspect of education, seeking to commodify education, and therefore undermining the essence of education as a public good. We would lead the campaign in a number of developing countries. We started in Kenya and Ghana. We started in the Philippines and India. We started in Brazil and Colombia. Whilst we were going to lead the campaigns in these countries, simultaneously we were working with member organisations in other countries in order to link up the national campaigns that they were already waging against privatisation and commercialisation. This is a global phenomenon. The danger is such, the strength and influence of our opponents and critics is such, that no one single union, no one single country can address this phenomenon alone. We need a genuine global response. Our analysis found and reaffirmed that privatisation is manifesting itself in many different forms. And the form in which it manifests itself in various countries depends on a range of factors: historical, cultural and political. In countries where the history of public education is relatively new, where public education systems are weak, we see a phenomenon of privatisation that is quite grotesque. We see privatisation taking the form of corporate actors wanting to establish chains of for-profit private schools, not to supplement education provision, but to supplant public education provision. In the global north, the manifestation was different. We saw what we describe as a privatisation in education. And I'll come back to that more in a minute or two. But let's go to the developing world. As I said, in the developing world, we're seeing a manifestation of privatisation, which is grotesque. Global corporate actors. I'm not talking here about traditional non-state actors. Traditional non-state actors that predate public education in these countries, in all countries in fact. We need to recognise that public education in historical terms is a relatively new phenomenon. It's about 150 years old to 200 years old. In developing countries, it's much less. I'm not talking about, let me repeat, the traditional non-state actors. I'm talking about a new phenomenon. The entry into education of global corporate actors, edu-businesses, operating with business plans. One of the companies that we've identified in Africa, for example, also exists in India, is called Bridge International Academies. It's supported by the global edu-business Pearson, but also by the World Bank, by DFID, the United Kingdom's aid wing, by Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, by Bill Gates, powerful influencers. Bridge International Academies is seeking to expand its operation, not only in Africa but around the developing world, in order to profit from the poor, to exploit the aspirations of children and parents alike with respect to education. They've invented this model, a business plan. It's a business plan which is predicated upon what they called low-cost education, affordable education for the poor. That in itself is offensive. It's offensive because when it comes to the poorest of the poor, any price on education is a barrier of access for the poorest of the poor. Any price. They say that their pricing structure is such that the poorest can attend. All of our analysis show this is not correct. When the fee you charge represents up to 40% of the daily income of the poorest of the poor, there is nothing affordable about it. And to describe it as low cost, the question needs to be asked, low cost for whom? Now there's another issue here as well, and that is that it undermines the very commitments given by the international community through the Sustainable Development Goals, where governments and global corporations, including Pearson and others, are committed to ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning for all. Target number 1 of that goal, 4.1, talks about ensuring free primary and secondary education for every girl and boy. Any price represents an undermining of the commitment to free education. Free is free. It's not low cost, it's not affordable, it's free education. Its business plan is also predicated upon the employment of unqualified teachers, delivering a highly scripted curriculum in facilities that are quite frankly not fit for purpose. Now you would know, as I do, and all of us do, that when it comes to a school education budget, teachers make up approximately 70% of the school budget, give or take a few percent. If you want to make a lot of profit out of education, well, what you do is you either employ fewer qualified teachers, underqualified staff, or unqualified staff. In the case of Bridge, over 70% of the staff it employs are high school graduates, are not qualified. Many of them are high school graduates. They're paid but a fraction of a teacher's salary, and hence they're able to increase their profits. Because of the fact that these graduates are unqualified, they have also developed a highly scripted curriculum. It also allows them to make further profit through the economies of scale with the development and delivery of a curriculum that is identical in every setting, regardless of the background of students, cultural, linguistic and otherwise. The curriculum is so scripted that it is delivered via these unqualified staff reading word for word off an iPad. The instructions in the lessons also include, for example, now circulate around the room for 30 seconds. Now rub the board. now tell students to close their books. That is not a high quality curriculum. It is a curriculum, in fact, that is developed far away from the country in which it is being delivered. It's being developed in the US, for example, in Boston, uploaded onto iPads and delivered word for word in Kenya, in Uganda, in Nigeria. Not at all sensitive to cultural and linguistic needs. And of course, as I said, these facilities are very poor. They're hardly what you would call safe facilities. Our campaigning has been driven by, and the goal of our campaigning rather, has been to expose this. To expose it and halt it, and where we can, reverse it. Our campaigning efforts to date are paying off. Now I know in the union movement we're not used to too many success in our daily lives, but we are having success. Through our campaigning efforts in Uganda, for example, the minister announced the closure of Bridge International Academies because they failed to respect the laws of that country, because they're operating without a license to operate. Because that's the other thing about these companies. They don't respect national sovereignty. They believe that the laws of these nations should bend to accommodate their business plan. They go in there and they establish 1 or 2 schools, get a license to do so, and without any reference again to governments, expand very rapidly. But of course, these global corporations don't sit down and accept these outcomes. They challenged the government. They took the government of Uganda to the High Court. They lost. Unfortunately, they're still operating in contempt of the court and in contempt of the government. The campaign continues to insist that the government enforce its laws in Uganda. We're having similar outcomes in Kenya. Bridge is only one example. There are other companies. In Ghana, the same business model, but it's operated by a company called Omega, also supported by Pearson, the global edu business. In the Philippines, we have similar companies, similar business plans, but it's called APEC. They're supported by Pearson as well. You see the Pearson link, this large global edu business? They're seeking to influence policy in so many different countries. It's no wonder that a lot of people now are describing this phenomenon, whether it's in the Philippines, in India, Africa or elsewhere, as a form of neo-colonialism. Our campaigning in the Global South has not been without risk. When you take on big corporate interests, there are risks. Now, we often only used to think about these risks in the context of investigative journalism and reporting in the areas of environmental disasters or mining disasters and the like. We often read about journalists or investigators being imprisoned, being beaten, missing in some cases. Well, let me tell you that this world is a world that world that I've just described is a world that we are inhabiting now in education as well. In 2016, our researcher in Uganda was arrested under false allegations at a meeting he organised with the head of Bridge International Academies at a coffee shop in Kampala. They arranged for him to be arrested. Fortunately, we got him out. When we did get him out and back to Canada, he's a Canadian citizen, we created a storm, a media storm around the world. And that, we believe, also contributed to the positive outcomes that we're achieving in Uganda. That gives you a description of what's happening in the developing countries with the manifestation of privatisation, commercialisation in the form of low-fee, for-profit chains of schools. In the global north, it's different. And that's because, as I said earlier, a range of political and historical factors. Our school systems are stronger than in many countries in the developing world. We have a longer tradition of public education in our countries. It's harder for these corporate actors to take over and establish chains of for-profit schools. Not impossible. We see what they're doing in the United States with charter schools and chains of charter schools, all of which is going to get much worse with the Trump administration. But what we see in the global north primarily is a different manifestation of privatisation. We see these large global companies trying to find a point of entry to take over an aspect of education. And once it's done so, once it's commercialised this aspect of education, it seeks to colonise other aspects of education. Now let me expand on this. And this may be relevant for your circumstances, because in our countries, the commercialisation and privatisation in education, it manifests itself and expands by way of a creeping effect. It creeps up to you. You don't always see it. Some people describe it as a tsunami. And that's because when a tsunami occurs, you don't see a wave come over you. What happens is the water rises, and then it's too late to get out of the way. So what's happening, for example, in our countries? A large company like Pearson, a global company like Pearson, it's bigger than many countries. Its financial and political influence. They go to a government and they say that based on all the public data that's available, your system is in crisis. How often do you hear governments and corporate actors talk about a crisis in our education systems? I always say the only crisis is the crisis of political will. It's not a crisis in education, it's a crisis in government for not doing the right thing with education. So they say to the government, there's a crisis in education. And we can help you. But to help you, we will need to better diagnose the problem, so we want to conduct some tests, standardised tests. And guess what? We produce standardised tests and you can buy them from us. All of a sudden, this corporation has entered the testing market. So they conduct the testing. But they then say, if you want to do well in these standardised tests, you might be interested in buying these resources that provide lessons and preparations for the tests. And guess what? We publish these resources. While you're at it, having diagnosed the problem through our standardised tests, we can conduct an evaluation of teachers using our metrics. And we have a policy here, we have a process of teacher evaluation that we can sell you. All of a sudden, from assessment, testing, they've colonised resource, teacher evaluation. But then they go next step. Not only do you want our resources, what about if we design your curriculum for you? We don't need teachers writing curriculum anymore. Why don't you outsource your curriculum development to us? Assessment, curriculum development, teacher evaluation. Your laws allow us to establish teacher education institutions. Assessment, curriculum, teacher evaluation, teacher preparation. You see, they've occupied the whole supply chain. They've commercialised the whole supply chain. Education is being privatised. The role of the teacher has been sidelined. Your role has been sidelined. And that is how we talk about, and that is why we talk about the impact of privatisation on the profession and the deprofessionalisation of teachers. We are considered as nothing more than content deliverers. Not teachers, content deliverers. And in that world, you don't need a qualified teacher. Now, it's not only in Africa where we've got the phenomenon of corporations employing unqualified teachers. There are examples in the United States and elsewhere where we are seeing a push to employ people other than teachers in our schools. If you go to a UK website, it's called Unqualified Teachers UK. You'll see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of jobs being advertised for unqualified teachers. In the state of Arizona, in the United States, they want to change the law, the Education Act, such that they're going to remove the word teacher. No longer will schools be required to employ teachers, they'll only be required to employ persons. Persons. Now, they qualify some skills this person may have, but persons, not teachers. There is a push to get teachers out of the way. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First, the profit motive. As I've already said, whether it's in Africa or in the developed world, in your country, Teachers constitute about 70% of the school budget. You get rid of qualified teachers, you start making profit. The other reason, of course, is they want to weaken the profession and our unions. The biggest obstacle for these privatisers, these profiteers, are teachers' unions. We stand between our students and their dream to exploit our students. Why do they want to exploit our students? Whether it's early childhood, primary, secondary, vocational education or universities. Why? Because the education market is valued at more than $5 trillion a year. By 2020, it's estimated that the education market will be valued at $6.3 trillion a year. They want to get their hands onto that budget. They want to get their hands onto that money. Education is the most, and children are the most sustainable resource in the world. That's why they want to come after it. Once you've fished the last fish out of the ocean and depleted fisheries, once you've cut down the last tree in the last forest in the world, once you've dug out and mined the last nugget of gold from the last mine in the world, one thing is for certain: children will continue and education will continue. It's the most sustainable resource in the world that they want to exploit. We are that barrier, that obstacle between our children, our students, their families and their aspirations, and corporate actors who want to take over the world. That's the other thing. We can't ignore the importance, the power of education, the power of curriculum, the power of teaching and learning. Curriculum and what children are taught and how they're taught, the pedagogy of it, is so important. The curriculum is one of the most powerful agents in our society. The curriculum informs not only what we're teaching our students today, but how we might want them to act and operate as global citizens into the future. These are substantial issues of concern, and they should be of concern to you and to every teacher. Proud, concerned, engaged. Proud of what we do. Proud of what we do every single day in our classrooms. There is no nobler profession than teaching. There is no nobler profession than teaching, where we have the responsibility to see the development of the child into that future responsible citizen. We're concerned about what's happening around the world. I don't know the exact manifestations of privatisation in and of education in your country, but I bet it's happening. I go around the world and some of our colleagues say privatisation is not happening in our country. I said, really? You may not be aware of it. And if it's not, it's a case of not yet. You need to engage in the analysis to look at how privatisation and the extent to which it's manifesting itself in your country. Don't let it creep up on you. Don't let the tsunami come over you. Start the analysis now. And that analysis comes through a deep engagement. Proud, concerned, engaged. A deep engagement at every level. At every level. From the classroom level to the school staff room level to the union level at the national level. We must be engaged. This is the biggest issue of our times. This is the biggest threat in every country around the world. And what we need to do is ensure that we deliver a genuine global response to expose, halt and reverse this cancer of privatisation in the interest of what is so dear for us, and that is quality education for every child, regardless of background. Thank you.